Harold Bloom is one of this country's preeminent literary critics. He is Sterling Professor of Humanities at Yale University, as well as Berg Professor of English at New York University. He has edited and written the introduction, some 400 volumes of literary criticism. He is also author of over 20 books, including such influential works as The Anxiety of Influence and the Western Canon. His new book, Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, examines the works of our greatest English playwright. It has already been nominated for a National Book Award, and I am always pleased to have him here, especially this evening. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you.
How are you?
Ooh, I'm breathing.
Come on now.
If at 68...
You have much to look forward to.
I hope so.
You do.
It's very kind of you. We will hope that you are right.
I am right. You know that. We have to talk about...
You have always been a fierce optimist.
I am a fierce optimist. That's exactly right. And you?
A realistic pessimist.
A knowledgeable pessimist.
I don't know about knowledgeable. Never mind.
No, but are you pessimistic, essentially? I mean, you have, I'm aware of the struggles of your life.
Well, one hopes for self-clarification. And sometimes one is afraid it is not really going to come. But
all right. I want you then to take a leap from where we just are, where we are now in the conversation about sense of attitude and a sense of perspective, or whether it's character be of mine or yours, and leap forward what Shakespeare has taught you about self-examination.
I think that Shakespeare had the first sense I know of what he actually called the self-same, which is the persistence of identity through all kinds of vicissitudes and changes. And I think that what is most crucial and important about Shakespeare, that we have obfuscated that both in our universities and on our stages in recent years, is his intensely vital sense of personality. No author, by far, no author I know of, Eastern or Western world, has ever invented so many vibrant and original personalities.
Give me an example of what you're talking about.
Falstaff, Hamlet.
Well, they're your two favorites.
Yeah, Cleopatra, Iago.
Yeah. King
Lear himself. And minor figures, apparently minor figures, like Barnardine, whom you see so briefly in Measure for Measure, the criminal who refuses to be executed, but who is incredibly memorable. Sometimes in just... Think of Shylock. Shylock speaks fewer than, 350, 360 sentences and lines. And yet the vividness is astonishing.
Yeah, but for you, it's an evil vividness.
Well, the play, I do not think that Shakespeare was himself personally anti-Semitic, but the play is a profoundly anti-Semitic play, yes.
There are no redeeming values in Shylock.
In Shylock, no. There are redeeming values in the play. There are no redeeming values in Shylock, no.
In the character.
No. Well, Shakespeare prevents that. The most outrageous thing about the play, which I have never seen much commentary upon, is that Shakespeare invents the conversion of Shylock, the enforced conversion which Shylock accepts at the end of Act 4, which is no part of the pound of flesh tradition. Shakespeare didn't have to do it. And I wonder indeed why he did it, because he destroys the dramatic consistency of the characters. I think I've remarked somewhere, perhaps not in this book, Shylock agreeing to become a Christian, even in preference to death, is rather like Cleopatra consenting to become a Vestal Virgin at Rome. It is not persuasive.
Yes.
Shakespeare is punishing himself and punishing Shylock, but for reasons I don't altogether understand.
Do you find something new at every reading?
Oh, yes.
You do?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Well, not in all 39 plays, but 24 or 25 of the 38 or 39 plays are so astonishingly original, so endlessly fresh and exuberant, that I think you would have to be deaf, stupid, blind, quite dumb, not to find something utterly new each time round.
Critics are saying, this is a terrific book. You know that. And they don't say, no, follow the question.
I'm following the question.
They don't necessarily believe you have to buy your thesis that Shakespeare invented human personality to appreciate and enjoy your analysis and your passionate feeling for him.
Well, that is a perhaps kind way of putting it on their part. But I still would like to know where our idea of personality came from, if it did not come from Shakespeare's characters.
There's no evidence of our ideas of personality before Shakespeare?
There are ideas of moral character, which are very powerful, before Shakespeare. There are notions of pathos. Individuals change because their relation to God or the gods change. Individuals indeed sicken, grow old, and die. But they do not change because their relation to themselves changes. They do not change because they overhear themselves and are startled by what they overhear, and on that basis undergo extraordinary vicissitudes of mutability. No, that seems to me shockingly original with Shakespeare. I don't even think that my thesis is that original. It comes ultimately out of Dr. Samuel Johnson and William Hazlitt, my heroic precursors.
Yes, exactly.
Whom we have largely forgotten because we are inundated. Yes, go on.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. I'm not going to interrupt. I want you to finish. I have a question.
We are inundated with politicized Shakespeare, both in the classroom and on our stages.
What does that mean, politicized? That those who stage Shakespeare
those who
bring
stage
their own
Shakespeare
political...
and those who teach Shakespeare, I will be generous about it for once. I will say that they are attempting to establish the relevance of Shakespeare. But you know, Charlie, to set out to establish the relevance of Shakespeare is a rather hopeless project. It's rather like saying, I'm going to establish the relevance of my own mother and father. Whether you think they're relevant or not, your own mother and father are always going to be relevant.
It's
and
not
Shakespeare,
your choice to make that relevancy because it's...
No, Shakespeare is our mother and our father.
Why do you consider Samuel Johnson Hazlitt your precursors?
Well, because
they engaged in literary criticism?
Because Johnson is the first critic to see and to say very powerfully that what is extraordinary about Shakespeare is, as Johnson calls it, the creation of distincts, characters who differ absolutely from one another and from every other literary character or representation, and characters who speak differently from every other. Hazlitt, because Hazlitt sees that what matters in the play most, in fact, that's what he called his splendid book, The Characters of Shakespeare's Plays. That plot is secondary, that action is secondary, that ideas or politics or religion are not even secondary, that what matters is the exuberant play of fresh personality.
Shakespeare wrote around the turn from the 16th to the 17th century.
Yes.
I think the last play was about 1615, wasn't it? Somewhere right in there?
No, earlier than that.
1612, maybe?
About 1612, yes. He dies about 1616. If I remember properly.
How do you explain Shakespeare?
The best possible question to ask. At the beginning of this book, I can say I can't explain him after all these decades of teaching him. I think the proper stance towards him is awe. It is astonishing that it could have happened. You can trace any other writer to some source. You can talk about, if you will, societal context. You can talk about history. But Shakespeare transcends any context that you try to find for him. The power of creation in him, I think I can even focus it. There's an excess in him. There is an overflowing, not just of meaning, but of being. There is a sheer newness which comes flowing out of him, for which we have no precedent. And in a deep sense, he has had no successors, in spite of the fact that he's been such an immense influence on all who came afterwards. He is, I suppose, the largest single miracle I know of, not just in the history of the human arts, but in the history of human consciousness. I suppose that if you are a religious believer, then, you might want to talk about Moses and Jesus and Mohammed. But as a secular figure, this is as astonishing a phenomenon as any of the great religious founders have been. This is indeed the secular scripture, the complete plays of Shakespeare or the complete works of Shakespeare. I think I remarked somewhere in that book, in a kind of wonder myself, that Hamlet has become the intellectual's Christ. And even though in the past I have been much condemned for saying that the Western worship of God is the worship in the end of three literary characters, you know, the Yahwist or J-Write is Yahweh, the Gospel of Mark's original Jesus, and Muhammad's Allah, I think only Shakespeare competes in his 9 or 10 strongest characters with those three great literary characters, which of course, you know, is a somewhat blasphemous thing to say. But I am a bardolater. At one point in the book, I only half-jokingly, since I am a dinosaur now in academic terms, I refer to myself as Bloom Brontosaurus bardolator. And I think that's a perfectly good description. I see that's been quoted against me by several reviewers, but it seems to me a perfectly valid self-designation. But no, I cannot explain Shakespeare. I can appreciate Shakespeare. I can hope to help others to appreciate him more. I can hope to teach others to see that we must not condescend to him, that he is always out ahead of us, that he always knows more than we do, that he has always more than anticipated our latest developments. You can push any idea you want to into Shakespeare, and it will not necessarily light up the play, but the play will light up the idea. That is to say, the power of mind, the power of consciousness, the power of sheer stuff of being in him is beyond parallel. And if it's beyond parallel, then in some sense it's beyond explanation. I think my largest single quarrel, aside from people who politicize Shakespeare or who, you know, put on a production of The Tempest in which suddenly both Caliban and Ariel are rebellious black slaves, you know, contending, I mean, it just isn't so. Ariel is an angel and is not rebellious, has a strange love for Prospero, even though it is difficult for Ariel. And Caliban is certainly no black slave. He is only half human. He has a Berber witch mother and some sort of sea beast or sea devil for a father. But I think it's far worse to historicize Shakespeare. Ralph Waldo Emerson, whom I also worship as I worship Hazlitt and Dr. Johnson, chose to begin his first set of essays with an essay called History, which every professional historian I've known, including the great Van Woodward, has always denounced to me. It opens with a great sentence: there is no history, only biography. But the problem is now with Shakespeare, we haven't really got the biography. We've got a few external facts. I remarked somewhere in the book that, what do we know about Shakespeare? He seems to have been very lustful towards both men and women. You can tell from the plays that he greatly preferred drinking to eating and that he hated lawyers, but you really don't know much else.
I find extraordinary that the modernity.
But that is what I mean by saying it's beyond relevance.
Exactly.
It's beyond, I mean, what we do these days with our so-called post-modernity, which is going to, post-millennial, just disappear and be vacuous and out of fashion. He is so far ahead of the postmodern, or whatever the post-postmodern will be. It's like Whitman at the end of Song of Myself saying, I stopped somewhere waiting for you. You know, catch up with me if you can. Shakespeare, even more so, always seems to be saying implicitly, I stopped somewhere waiting for you. It's your business to somehow catch up to me. And you know, this is not a good time, Charlie, no matter what side one is on politically. It's quite awful what has happened, I think, to the teaching of literature in the universities. I mean, stop me on this, because I've become permanently furious on this subject. But they don't teach literature anymore, for the most part. They teach ideology of one sort or another. And most productions that I see of Shakespeare are ideologically over-considered. Ian McKellen is a great actor, but I want to see him play Richard III. I don't want to see him play Sir Oswald Mosley, as I did at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, where a brilliant director, was it Mr. Eyre, I think, of the Old Vic? Richard Eyre. Yeah, was so concerned still to fight the battle against the Lady Astor and the Cliveden set that it was definitely Sir Oswald Mosley.
Yeah.
What can one do? High concept directors are, I think, now the curse of Shakespearean production.
Who's the greatest Shakespearean actor of
the 20th century?
Mm-hmm.
Sir Ralph Richardson, overwhelmingly. That book exists because when I was 15, I saw here in New York City the Old Vic with Ralph Richardson playing Falstaff in part 1 of Henry IV in the matinee, and then that same evening, Falstaff in part 2, with Olivier playing Hotspur in the afternoon, and marvelously, just as Shallow in the evening. Richardson is much the finest actor that I have ever seen, Shakespearean actor. But the British, you know, they're very strange, the English or the British. They don't produce poets anymore, though they don't like my saying that. They've got one poet at the moment, Geoffrey Hill, and he lives in Boston. They've got one novelist, and that's Iris Murdoch, and she's got Alzheimer's. The ones who come after her are not very impressive. They don't really have composers anymore. But my heavens, do they have actors? Every time I look up, there are a dozen new Shakespearean actors and actresses who really can do astonishing things.
True.
And
I don't know why that is either.
I don't understand it.
I mean, is their tradition so different?
I think their tradition is much more comprehensive than ours is, and there's much more continuity there. We have some good Shakespearean actors, but we don't have this plethora, this endless stream.
And are good actors more likely, more often, to leave the stage?
Yes, yes. Whereas theirs return to the stage.
Right. That umbilical cord is always there.
It always brings them back, whereas ours do not necessarily come back.
Shakespeare could have been writing about not just his time, but any time.
Oh, I think he took great care to be writing about all time.
And
It's very difficult to know, even in the histories, whether you really are in the time that he is supposedly talking about.
in the end, it's more about, though, his true genius is about not plot, but character.
He was not terribly interested in plot. He didn't like to devise plots. He stole them wherever and whenever he could, you know, with both hands. When he hasn't got a source, as in The Tempest, you've got a plotless play. Nothing happens.
Yeah.
No, he was not terribly interested in action. He was no Aristotelian. He was immensely fascinated by men and by women. And I think he taught us more. I mean, that truly is the invention of the human. I mean, where else do you learn that the ultimate difference between men and women is that on the whole, women are compelled to marry down, not because of social convention, not because of social constriction, but simply because, for the most part, the best among them are better than the best among us. That's hardly a feminist remark on my part. Feminist critics and I do not get along, which is notorious. But Shakespeare is fiercely perceptive, I think, in the inadequacy of men as compared to women. He somehow understood that that a woman could be at 14 or 15 emotionally and spiritually and in terms of generosity fully mature, and that it took men 60 or 70 years and then all they were really good for was to die.
We still don't know, knowing so little about Shakespeare, we do not know why he was so obsessed and fascinated and wise about inner self.
No.
We don't know. We don't know the curiosity. We don't know the
No, we don't know
intellect.
that.
We don't know.
We don't know that. There's such a gap between his apparent origins and what he is able to do that I don't think we will ever solve that. There has to have been a great deal of personal suffering there. His one son, Hamnet, died when he was still quite a young boy. And there seems to have been a great deal of erotic suffering.
Erotic suffering.
Great deal of erotic suffering.
What
The
does that mean?
sonnets.
What is erotic suffering? Meaning he was heartbroken?
I think the sonnets seem to show that he felt profoundly betrayed both by a man and by a woman, both of whom he had loved. And I think that gets into the plays also.
This book, you go through 35. You begin with these two quotes, one from Nietzsche. The
one from Nietzsche fascinates me. I've been much condemned for it because it's my own translation, but I think I've gotten it right. And I got it from one of my mentors, the late, great great Kenneth Burke, who always loved to quote that to me and said, Harold, I hand it to you, use it, and I have used it. That for which we can find words is something already dead in our hearts. There's always a kind of contempt in the act of speaking. That's pure Hamlet. And it's profoundly unsettling. It means that if somebody says that they love you, you can't believe them, because they're saying something which is already dead in their hearts. And I juxtaposed it with the astonishing lines at the end of the play A King's Speech, which is undoubtedly written by Hamlet himself, when he converts the murder of Gonzago into the mousetrap. But orderly to end where I begun, our wills and fates do so contrary run that our devices all are overthrown. Our thoughts are ours, their ends none of our own. I guess it's a kind of despairing juxtaposition. But I think Shakespeare did despair. I think the burden of his work, if you follow it, shows him moving into a time of great rancidity of spirit in Troilus and Cressida and Measure for Measure, and ending in the two noble kinsmen in the parts of the play that he wrote with a real revulsion from human sexuality. And I think that transcends dramatic representation. I think there is a cri de coeur there.
This book goes from the early comedies, A Comedy of Errors, Taming of the Shrew, Two Gentlemen of Verona, through the first histories, Henry VI, King John, Richard III, the Apprentice tragedies, including Julius Caesar, the high comedies, including A Midsummer Night's Dream, The Merchant of Venice, Much Ado About Nothing, the major histories, Richard II, Henry IV, Merry Wives of Windsor, to the problem plays, All's Well That Ends Well, the great tragedies, Hamlet, Othello, Lear, Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra, to the tragic epilogue, the late romances.
They hadn't called them romances. That was Edward Dowden, an Irish critic, friend of the Yates family in the late Victorian period. They're not romances. They're tragicomedies of a very peculiar kind. But to call them romances is to make them more supernatural than they really are.
Do you feel that this was the book that you had to write, and this is somehow your...
Makes me sad. I will not write anything like this again. I mean, quite aside from the fact that an old fellow...
68.
I'm 68.
Carried away with age.
Oh, I know. But you are perpetually young. You are the fountain of youth. I am not. No, I was a long time writing this. I wrote other things in between. I'm writing a book now called How to Read and Why, which will be a short book, and I hope a pungent and useful one. This tries to be useful. You know, this is not addressed to academics, God knows. I don't want one of them to read it. I see a couple of them have reviewed it. I wish they hadn't. It is for what Johnson and Virginia Woolf called common readers and common playgoers. It aspires to be helpful. I mean, aside from what the argument of it is or is not, and you don't even have to read it, you know, in toto. I have allowed some incremental repetitions because I want people to be able to read a chapter before they go see a particular play, or read a particular play and then read a chapter, and see if it's somewhat helpful, as I hope it is. But it makes me sad now that it's over, yes, because I figure it's my book. I not only won't do better, but I think the book is better than I am, which makes me sad. Partly because it's Dr. Johnson and Hazlitt, from whom I have borrowed so liberally.
Thank you for coming.
Bless you. Thank you for having me, Charlie.
Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, Harold Bloom.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.